Hey, welcome back to Late Night Psychology. Get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're going to talk about something dark, something that lives inside all of us, the desire for revenge. You've felt it before. Someone wrongs you, betrays you, humiliates you, and something inside you says they should pay. Maybe you didn't act on it. Maybe you just imagined it. The perfect comeback, the moment they realize what they've lost. The look on their face when karma finally arrives. That fantasy, it feels good, and there's a reason for that. When researchers put people in brain scanners and asked them to imagine punishing someone who had wronged them, something interesting happened. The dorsal striatum lit up. That's the part of the brain associated with reward, pleasure, anticipation of something satisfying. Your brain treats the idea of revenge the way it treats the idea of chocolate, or sex, or winning. It promises you this will feel good. This is why revenge fantasies are so common, so vivid, so satisfying. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do, motivating you to punish those who harmed you so they won't do it again. But here's the question we're exploring tonight. Does revenge actually feel good? When people move from fantasy to action, when they actually take revenge, do they get the satisfaction their brain promised them? The answer, according to decades of research, is surprising and disturbing. Tonight, we're going to explore 3 psychological mechanisms that drive people toward revenge. Rumination, the obsessive replaying of injury that keeps wounds from healing. Narcissistic injury, the wound to the ego that feels like an attack on existence itself. And the paradox of revenge, the strange finding that getting what you want makes you feel worse. And we'll follow one case that shows all of them working together. A woman who spent years consumed by grievance, who finally acted on her darkest impulses, who got exactly what she wanted, and who 35 years later still hasn't found peace. Let's start with a word. Rumination. It comes from the Latin ruminare, what cows do when they chew their food, swallow it, bring it back up, and chew it again. In psychology, rumination means something similar. It's when your mind chews on the same thought over and over, swallows it, brings it back up, chews it again. You replay a conversation, re-examine an injury, re-feel the anger, and you can't stop. A psychiatrist at Harvard once described it like this. Rumination is like picking a scab. You know you shouldn't, but you can't help it. The problem is, every time you pick that scab, you prevent the wound from healing. And when the wound is an injury to your sense of self, a betrayal, an injustice, a humiliation, rumination can keep that wound open for months, years, sometimes a lifetime. The American Psychological Association defines rumination as obsessional thinking involving excessive, repetitive thoughts or themes that interfere with other forms of mental activity. Notice that phrase, interfere with other forms of mental activity. That's key. When you're ruminating, you're not just having a thought. You're stuck in a loop that prevents you from thinking about anything else. Your whole mental life gets organized around the grievance. In 2001, a psychologist named Denis Sukhodolsky developed something called the anger rumination scale. He wanted to measure how people think about anger after the fact. He identified 4 components. The first is angry afterthoughts. You replay the incident in your mind after it's over. You think about what you should have said, what you wish you had done. The questionnaire asks people to rate statements like, I reenact the anger episode in my mind after it has happened. The second is thoughts of revenge. You imagine ways to get back at the person who hurt you. You fantasize about their suffering. You plan how you would make them pay. The questionnaire asks, I have long-living fantasies of revenge after the conflict is over. The third is angry memories. Old grievances resurface. You remember things that happened years ago, and they still make you furious. I think about certain events from a long time ago, and they still make me angry. And the fourth is understanding causes. You analyze why this happened. You think about the reasons people treat you badly. You build a case for why they're wrong and you're right. I think about the reasons people treat me badly. Here's what the research shows. People who score high on anger rumination are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, sleep problems, physical health issues, and they're more likely to act aggressively. Because rumination doesn't discharge anger, it feeds it. Each cycle through the loop makes the anger stronger, not weaker. The wound gets deeper, not shallower. A study from the University of Liverpool found something striking. When researchers looked at what predicted depression and anxiety after traumatic experiences, rumination was the biggest factor, bigger than the severity of the trauma itself, bigger than self-blame or guilt. What determined whether people got stuck in suffering wasn't what happened to them. It was whether they kept thinking about it. Now, imagine you're a woman in San Diego in 1983. You've been married for 14 years. You have 4 children. You put your husband through medical school and law school, working to support the family while he studied. You remember those years, the tiny apartments, the night shifts, the children you raised mostly alone while he was studying. You believed it was an investment, that when he became successful, the good times would come, that you would share in the rewards of all that sacrifice. Now he is successful, a prominent attorney, president of the San Diego Bar Association. You live in a beautiful home in La Jolla. You belong to country clubs. You drive nice cars. You take ski vacations. You did everything right. You were the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the woman who stood by her man. And then your husband tells you he's leaving you for his 21-year-old receptionist. This is where Betty Broderick's story begins. And this is where rumination takes hold. Betty and Dan Broderick met in 1965 at a Notre Dame football game. She was from a good family in New York. He was ambitious, charming, intelligent. They married in 1969. She was 21, he was 24. For the next 16 years, Betty devoted herself to building Dan's career and raising their family. She worked as a teacher and a medical assistant to support them while Dan finished medical school. Then he decided to go to law school too, so Betty kept working, kept supporting. She had 4 children during these years, often managing them largely alone. She believed this was the deal. You sacrifice now, you reap the rewards later. And for a while, the rewards came. By the 1980s, Dan was one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego. They had the big house, the country club membership, the social status. Betty was a society wife, active in her children's schools, involved in the community. She had played her part perfectly. At first, Betty couldn't believe it. Dan, her husband, denied everything. He said she was imagining things, being paranoid, going crazy. But Betty knew. She had seen the signs, the late nights, the phone calls, the way he looked at Linda Kolkena, his young assistant. She found a receipt for earrings she never received. She found a message from Linda on the answering machine. Dan kept denying it for months, for years, even after he moved out, even after he filed for divorce. He kept telling her she was the problem, that she was unstable, that she needed help. This is what psychologists call gaslighting, making someone question their own perception of reality. And it fed Betty's rumination, because now she wasn't just angry about the affair, she was angry about the lies, the denial, the way Dan made her doubt herself. She was angry that he was telling everyone she was crazy while she knew the truth. The divorce dragged on for years. And during those years, Betty ruminated. She replayed every conversation, every slight, every injustice. She built a case in her mind. Dan had used her, exploited her, thrown her away when he didn't need her anymore. He had made her put him through school, made her raise his children, made her sacrifice her own career and identity. And then, when he was successful, he traded her in for a younger model. The divorce proceedings made it worse. Dan was a skilled attorney with powerful connections. Betty felt outmaneuvered at every turn. He got the house. He got custody of the kids. He controlled the money. Betty felt like she was being erased, and every legal setback gave her more material for rumination, more evidence of how unfair the world was, more proof that Dan was winning and she was losing. This is what Sukhodolsky's research predicts. When you ruminate on an injury, you don't process it and move on. You deepen it. The anger gets stronger, not weaker. The sense of injustice gets more intense, not less. And the thoughts of revenge become more elaborate, more detailed, more appealing. Betty started acting out. She left obscene messages on Dan's answering machine, dozens of them, hundreds over the years. She called him names, threatened him, screamed profanities. One therapist who tried to mediate their custody arrangement described Betty as uncooperative, consumed by rage. Then the behavior escalated. Betty drove her car through the front door of Dan's house. She was put on a 72-hour psychiatric hold. She vandalized his property, spray-painted his walls, smeared cream pie on his belongings. She violated restraining orders again and again. Each act felt like justice, like standing up for herself. But nothing made her feel better, because rumination doesn't work that way. Each act of petty revenge just gave her more to think about, more interactions to replay, more grievances to nurse. The wound stayed open. For 5 years, Betty lived like this. Consumed by anger, unable to move forward, unable to let go. Her friends worried about her. Her children were caught in the middle. Her mental state deteriorated, but she couldn't stop, because rumination had become her identity. She wasn't Betty the mother, Betty the friend, Betty the person with a future. She was Betty the victim. Betty the wronged woman, Betty who deserved justice. And until she got that justice, she couldn't be anyone else. Dan and Linda got married in April 1989. Betty was not invited, of course. But she knew about it. She thought about it. She couldn't stop thinking about it. 7 months later, she made her decision. On November 5th, 1989, Betty Broderick drove to the home Dan shared with Linda. It was early morning, still dark. She let herself in with a key she had taken from her daughter. She walked upstairs to their bedroom, and she emptied a .38 caliber revolver into them as they slept. Linda died instantly, a bullet through her neck into her brain. Dan was hit in the back, his lung filled with blood. He suffocated slowly. Betty watched. Then she ripped the phone out of the wall so they couldn't call for help, and she left. Betty called her daughter afterward. "I finally did it," she said. Then she turned herself in. This is where rumination leads. Not always, not for everyone. Most people who ruminate don't become killers. But for Betty Broderick, 5 years of obsessive thinking had narrowed her world to a single point. Dan had to pay. Nothing else mattered. Take a breath. That was the first mechanism. Rumination, the wound that won't heal because you keep picking at it. But there's another mechanism that drives revenge, one that explains why some people react so intensely to injuries that others would shrug off. Let's explore that now. In 1972, a psychoanalyst named Heinz Kohut introduced a concept that would change how we understand extreme reactions to perceived slights. He called it narcissistic rage. Here's the basic idea. All of us have a sense of self, an image of who we are, a feeling of our own worth and importance. For most people, this sense of self is flexible, resilient. If someone criticizes us, we might feel bad for a while. But we recover, we adjust, we don't lose our fundamental sense of being okay. But for some people, the sense of self is fragile. It's built on a foundation of grandiosity, an inflated belief in their own specialness, importance, superiority. And when that inflated self-image is challenged, when they're criticized, rejected, humiliated, or shown to be less special than they believed, something breaks. Kohut called this a narcissistic injury. A narcissistic injury isn't just hurt feelings, it's experienced as an existential threat. The person's entire sense of who they are is built on being special, being right, being superior. When that's challenged, they don't just feel sad or embarrassed, they feel like they're being destroyed. And that feeling triggers a response that's completely out of proportion to the actual injury. Kohut described the characteristics of narcissistic rage. It's not just anger, it's a need to destroy, a need to annihilate the source of the injury, to obliterate the person who made them feel small. And that need doesn't fade with time the way normal anger does. It persists. It demands satisfaction. It won't let go until the balance is restored. Kohut wrote, "The need for revenge, for righting a wrong, for undoing a hurt by whatever means, and a deeply anchored, unrelenting compulsion in the pursuit of those aims. These are features which are characteristic of narcissistic rage in all its forms." Notice that phrase, unrelenting compulsion. Normal anger burns hot and fades. Narcissistic rage burns and burns and burns. Think about what this means. For most people, an insult is an insult. It stings, then it fades. For someone with a fragile, grandiose sense of self, An insult is an attack on their very existence, and attacks on existence demand a response. Researchers have found that narcissistic injury can occur on a continuum. At the mild end, you might see aloofness, passive aggression, the cold shoulder. At the severe end, you see explosive violence, even murder. Let me give you an example. On August 20th, 1986, a postal worker named Patrick Sherrill walked into the post office in Edmond, Oklahoma. He was carrying 3 handguns. In 14 minutes, he killed 14 co-workers and wounded 6 more. Then he shot himself. What triggered this? The day before, Sherrill had been reprimanded by 2 supervisors. They criticized his performance, told him he might face termination. That's it. For most people, this would be unpleasant, stressful, maybe a reason to start looking for another job. For Sherrill, it was unbearable. People who knew Sherrill described him as a loner, someone who didn't handle criticism well, someone who reacted to disrespect with intense, disproportionate anger. The reprimand wasn't just a work problem for him. It was a narcissistic injury. His response was narcissistic rage. This pattern appears again and again in workplace shootings and mass killings. The term going postal entered the American vocabulary because of cases like Sherrill's. Between 1986 and 1997, more than 40 people were killed in postal workplace shootings alone. The pattern was remarkably consistent: a worker who felt disrespected, a triggering event that wounded their pride, an explosion of violence directed at those they blamed. Researchers who study these events, people like Park Dietz and James Fox, have identified what they call the pseudo-commando profile. These are killers who plan their attacks carefully, who come heavily armed, who expect to die, and who are driven by an intense desire for revenge against a world they feel has disrespected them. In 1998, a Connecticut lottery accountant named Matthew Beck returned to work after a 4-month stress-related medical leave. 2 years earlier, he had been demoted. His pay had been cut. He felt humiliated. He spent those 2 years ruminating. Then he walked into the lottery headquarters and killed 4 of his supervisors. In 2012, a Minnesota man named Andrew Engeldinger was fired from his job at a sign company. Immediately after the termination meeting, he pulled out a gun. He killed the company founder, 2 managers, and 2 other employees, then himself. The pattern is always the same: a perceived injustice, a wound to the ego, rumination that builds and builds, and then violence that's meant to restore the balance, to say, I mattered, you shouldn't have dismissed me, now you'll never forget me. The pseudo-commando doesn't just want to hurt people. He wants to be seen, to send a message, to prove that he matters. The violence is a way of saying, you should have taken me seriously. The manifesto is a common feature. Many mass killers leave behind writings explaining their grievances. These documents are often full of complaints about being rejected, overlooked, disrespected, pages and pages of rumination frozen in time, evidence of minds that couldn't let go. The killers feel they've been treated unjustly, and the violence is their way of restoring balance, their way of making the world acknowledge their pain. Now let's go back to Betty Broderick, because narcissistic injury was part of her story too. Betty had built her identity around being a certain kind of woman, a good wife, a devoted mother, a woman who had sacrificed for her family and deserved to be rewarded. She had supported Dan through years of school. She had raised his children. She had made his success possible. And in her mind, that meant she deserved loyalty, respect, recognition. When Dan left her for a younger woman, it wasn't just a divorce. It was a repudiation of everything she believed about herself. It said, your sacrifices don't matter. Your contributions aren't valued. You're replaceable. Listen to how Betty described it years later. I would have been fine. I would have had my house, my kids. I would have still worn a size 6. That phrase, still worn a size 6, reveals something. Betty's sense of self was tied up in being desirable, valued, chosen. Dan's affair with a younger woman attacked all of that. It said, you're not enough. You're old. You're unwanted. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Betty diagnosed her with narcissistic and histrionic personality features. They described her as having an inflated sense of self-importance and a pattern of excessive attention-seeking. This doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps explain why the divorce felt like annihilation to her and why she couldn't let it go. Narcissistic injury and rumination work together in a devastating feedback loop. The injury creates a wound that feels existential, life-threatening, and rumination keeps that wound fresh, prevents it from healing. Every time Betty thought about Dan and Linda, their new life, their happiness, the wound opened again, and the rage demanded satisfaction. So far, we've talked about what drives people toward revenge: rumination that keeps the wound open, narcissistic injury that makes the wound feel existential. But here's the question that matters most. Does revenge actually help? When people finally get the payback they've been dreaming about, do they feel better? In 2008, a team of researchers decided to find out. Kevin Carl-Smith at Colgate, along with Timothy Wilson and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, designed an elegant experiment. They created a situation where participants played an economic game with partners. One partner, secretly controlled by the researchers, cheated, acted selfishly, took advantage of the others. Some participants, the punishers, were given the chance to get revenge by reducing the cheater's earnings. Others, the non-punishers, learned about the cheating but couldn't do anything about it. A third group, the forecasters, just predicted how they would feel if they could punish. Here's what the researchers expected to find based on how people talk about revenge. The punishers should feel satisfied, vindicated, better. The non-punishers should feel frustrated, helpless, worse. The results were exactly the opposite. The forecasters predicted that punishing would feel good, that it would provide satisfaction and closure. But the actual punishers, they felt worse, not just worse than they expected to feel, worse than the non-punishers who never got any revenge at all. 10 minutes after the game, the researchers measured how much participants were still thinking about the cheater. The punishers were thinking about him significantly more than the non-punishers. They were ruminating. The act of revenge hadn't provided closure, it had extended the obsession. Carl-Smith put it this way: those who don't have a chance to take revenge are forced, in a sense, to move on and focus on something different. When you can't punish, you eventually stop thinking about the injury. When you do punish, you keep thinking about it. This is the paradox of revenge. The brain promises satisfaction, but the act delivers rumination. Why does this happen? The researchers had a theory. When you take revenge, you're forced to keep thinking about the person who wronged you. You had to make a decision about how to punish them. You had to take action. You had to engage with the injury. All of that keeps the offender in your mind. But when you can't take revenge, and when that option is closed, your brain is forced to do something else. It starts to let go, not because you chose to, but because there's nothing else to do. The researchers called this forced adaptation. When you can't change a situation, your mind eventually adapts to it. The anger fades, the obsession loosens, life goes on. But when you can change the situation, when revenge is possible, your mind stays focused on the injury, waiting for the right moment, planning the response, keeping the wound fresh. There's a deeper irony here. People who take revenge often believe they're doing it for closure. They think, once I punish this person, I'll be able to move on. But the act of punishment doesn't provide closure. It provides more material for rumination. Now you have to think about what you did, how they reacted, whether it was enough. The loop continues. The English philosopher Francis Bacon wrote about this 400 years ago. A man that studieth revenge keeps his own wounds green, which otherwise would heal and do well. Green, fresh, open. The research confirms what Bacon intuited. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, it keeps them open. The poet John Milton put it differently in Paradise Lost. Revenge, at first though sweet, bitter ere long, back on itself recoils. The sweetness is real, the brain's reward centers do light up at the thought of revenge. But the bitterness that follows is real too, and it lasts longer than the sweetness. There's another layer to this. Research on forgiveness has found that people who forgive their offenders experience better mental health outcomes, lower depression, lower anxiety, greater life satisfaction, not because the wrong was undone, not because justice was served, but because they stopped ruminating. They put down the burden of the grievance. They let the wound finally heal. It's important to understand what forgiveness is and what it isn't. Forgiveness doesn't mean saying what happened was okay. It doesn't mean forgetting the offense. It doesn't mean reconciling with the person who hurt you. It doesn't mean giving up your right to justice. Forgiveness, in the psychological sense, is simply a decision to stop carrying the burden, to stop replaying the injury, to stop letting the offender occupy space in your mind. Researchers have found that forgiveness actually changes brain activity. When people forgive, they show reduced activation in the areas associated with negative emotion and rumination. They show increased activation in the areas associated with empathy and perspective taking. Forgiveness literally changes how the brain processes the injury. It moves it from an active wound to a healed scar. This is what Betty Broderick couldn't do. She got her revenge. On November 5, 1989, she killed the two people she blamed for destroying her life. Dan was dead. Linda was dead. Betty had won. Except she hadn't. At her trial, Betty showed no remorse. She portrayed herself as the victim. Dan had driven her to this. His psychological abuse had left her no choice. The prosecution described her as a cold-blooded killer bent on revenge. The defense argued she was a battered woman driven over the edge by years of psychological torture. The first trial ended in a hung jury. 2 jurors held out for manslaughter. At the second trial, she was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life. In prison, Betty continued to maintain her innocence. She continued to blame Dan. She continued to ruminate on the injustices she had suffered. She gave interviews, wrote letters, built her case again and again. At her first parole hearing in 2010, the board denied her request. One commissioner told her, "Your heart is still bitter and you are still angry." Still angry, 21 years after the murders. The wound still open. She was denied parole again in 2017. The board noted that she had not taken responsibility for her actions, had not shown genuine remorse, had not demonstrated insight into why what she did was wrong. Betty wrote afterward, "I have met all criteria for parole and my release date was 2010. Now I am only a political prisoner. They have no reason to deny my parole." Still the victim, still unable to see herself as the perpetrator of a double murder, still trapped in the narrative of her own righteousness. This is the paradox of revenge in its starkest form. Betty got exactly what she wanted. Dan and Linda are dead, and Betty is still consumed by the same anger, the same grievances, the same obsessive focus on what was done to her. The revenge didn't end her rumination, it extended it, possibly forever. Let's bring this together. Why do people seek revenge? Partly because the brain promises reward. The anticipation of payback activates the same circuits as other pleasures. Evolution built us to punish those who wrong us, partly because rumination keeps the wound open. When you can't stop thinking about what was done to you, the desire for justice never fades. And partly because narcissistic injury makes the wound feel existential. When your sense of self is attacked, the need to strike back feels like survival itself. But does revenge deliver what it promises? The research says no. People who take revenge feel worse than those who don't. They ruminate more, not less. They find it harder to move on. The wound they were trying to close stays open. Betty Broderick is an extreme example. Most people who feel wronged don't become killers, but the psychology she illustrates is universal. The desire for revenge is human, normal, perhaps even hardwired. Acting on it, though, doesn't bring peace. It brings more of the same, more anger, more obsession, more suffering. So what does help? The research points to something that feels almost impossible when you've been wronged. Letting go, not forgetting what happened, not saying it was okay, but choosing to stop carrying the burden, choosing to stop picking the scab, choosing to let the wound finally heal. This is extraordinarily difficult. Every part of your brain is telling you that revenge will feel good. Every rumination cycle is telling you that justice must be served. Every wound to your ego is telling you that the offender must pay. And yet, the research is clear. Those who let go feel better than those who don't. Those who forgive heal faster than those who seek revenge. Betty Broderick couldn't let go, couldn't forgive, couldn't imagine a self that wasn't defined by what Dan had done to her. And so she spent 35 years in prison, still angry, still bitter, still convinced she was the real victim. Revenge promised her satisfaction. It delivered a life sentence, not just the legal one, the psychological one, the one where she's still trapped, still angry, still fighting battles that ended decades ago. There's a Japanese proverb that says, if you seek revenge, dig 2 graves. Most people interpret this as a warning about the danger of retaliation. But the deeper meaning is this: the person seeking revenge destroys themselves in the process, not always physically, but psychologically, spiritually. They become prisoners of their own grievance. Betty Broderick is still alive as of this recording. She's in her late 70s. She's been in prison for 35 years. And by all accounts, she's still the same woman who pulled that trigger in 1989, still convinced she was justified, still unable to take responsibility, still trapped in the narrative of her own victimhood. The wound never healed, because she never stopped picking at it. Thank you for being here tonight. Be gentle with yourself and sleep well. This has been Late Night Psychology. Until next time.